What up, y'all? I'm Dr. CBS here with Dr. Layla Brown.
And you're tuned in for season 2, episode 1 of The Last Dope Intellectual.
Ow. All right, y'all, we are back with season 2. Finally, much awaited. As you see, we have some changes with our lineup. We got the co-host, the permanent co-host, Dr. Brown. We got our new producer, the big 2 Black, period.
So yeah, I'm too Black, as I just said. I'm here as a producer. I'm going to talk a little shit, but I'll leave most of that to them. And I host the Black Miss podcast. That does come on BPM. So I'm supporting everybody. It's all love. But yeah, so y'all be seeing me a little bit, but I'm gonna try to stay quiet.
All right, y'all. So for Shoot the Shit, what we wanted to talk about is basically, fuck celebrity culture and how it is that we define our movements and our issues for ourselves. Because it seems that so often celebrities draw attention to the issues that plague our community or that don't plague our community, issues that only pertain to them. And then all of a sudden it becomes an issue for Black people as a whole. And so we really need to move away from celebrity culture, not only getting our morals and values from them, but also stop it to, we need to stop letting celebrities define what's important to Black people. So what y'all think about this?
I mean, I think, the most recent example of this obviously is all of the sort of hubbub around Dave Chappelle's new special, The Closer, right? Which we're not going to discuss in detail the content of it, but in general, thinking about, for me, what's interesting about this is that on the so-called left, right, there's this pushback against celebrity culture because, he's rich, so now his position doesn't matter. But for me, pushing back against celebrity culture is both about not allowing them to dictate our politics, but also not getting so caught up in even a movement to cancel them, right? I mean, I think that celebrities still have the right to use their platforms to say what it is that they say. But if we are actually serious about rejecting celebrity culture, that means on the front and the back end. That means not being overly invested in what they say and also not being overly invested in canceling them in that particular kind of way. Because if we say that representation matters and we're always pushing back against the ability for people to have their say, then to me, that's a contradiction.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I just really don't care about the topic that much. And primarily because if the only time I'm talking about an issue is when a celebrity says it, then I question how much I actually care about it, right? So if I'm only talking about trans Black people because Dave Chappelle said it in a special, but I never am talking about it any other time, then how invested am I in that subject matter? And I think that's what celebrity culture exposes, is that often we're not talking about this shit unless it's trending. And usually it's a celebrity that gets it trending. Otherwise, like, we're not talking about when trans Black people get killed, it's not a conversation. You know what I mean? So and that's just an example of how with celebrities, they'll inject an issue and then all of a sudden we get on the different sides of it and you see it all over your timeline and it's the hot discussion and everybody's got a take on it. So I don't even know half the time if we're really debating or discussing what is like the actual topic that you hear or you read. I don't know if that's actually what it's about half the time. It's some signifier about your politics only being read through whatever was done in a special or whatever was said in some clip somewhere or whatever some athlete said. And you can't really, if you're talking about politics, you can't accomplish anything if you're only just reacting to the agenda they're setting, even if it's an issue that you support. So it's like, I support Black trans people, but if I don't care about it until then, I don't know, I'm not really helping them.
Period. And it seems to me that people get up in arms about celebrity shit, whether it be like celebrity controversy or even celebrity death, to amplify their clout or their care. Because if you care about trans people day to day, nobody's really going to know about that shit, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody's ever going to be able to see how down you are, whatever, how hard you work. But if you go hard on Dave Chappelle and you drag him or whomever else, right? You drag him and you shit on him every day. You list, you make this long thread about him and list every trans person who's been killed this year as part of your critique of Dave Chappelle, then it draws more attention to it, right? And so it seems to me that that's the other thing that we need to move away from is like, if it is that we care about poor people, trans people, unhoused people, exploited people, oppressed people in general, it doesn't matter if other people know. That should come through our work, not through how many likes, retweets, or yeah girls, or yeah boys, or yeah sibs you get.
Exactly. But I also think there is a delicate line that we walk, right? Because we do have to take advantage of moments, right? You take advantage of moments where something gets put on people's radar, because these are like, they have the potential to be watershed moments where you actually get a critical mass of people. But again, I think to both of you all's point, that has to be something that has to be the work that you're always doing. Mm-hmm. And so that when that moment happens, you're able to take advantage of it. And this is actually, for me, the way that I see organizing in general, right? Mm-hmm. So at the moment that Ferguson happened, right? At the moment that Baltimore happened, all of us who are invested in a particular kind of politics, we had to be involved in political organizations prior to that moment in order to be able to take advantage of that moment. Otherwise, it's literally just these these periods of mobilization without any real sense of organization. And so I think that that's actually the critique, right? Is that whatever we are invested in our sort of political lives, it has to be something that is sustained, that we are engaging in it in some kind of way on a daily basis, regardless of how prevalent or silent it might be in sort of public culture at the moment.
And I think that even with moments, right? Moments are made. And so it's like, what actually are we making into a moment? Did this Chappelle special actually have to be a moment? Like, did this, you know what I'm saying? So like, some of them are sort of happenstance. They just, things happen, like a protest erupts in Cuba or some shit, right? The US gets their ass whooped in Afghanistan, whatever. Those are moments that happen structurally. But then we also manufacture moments through social media and pop culture. And so it's like, what moments are we actually seeking to create and why? Does it always have to be around somebody who's prominent? It's the same thing about with old girl with tenure and all that shit. You know what I mean? And so it's like Black people don't get tenure every day. You feel me? So like, if we want this to be an actual issue about, just because we're academics, about discrimination or oppression in higher education, that's one thing. But we also need to be mindful of when we're centering the experiences. And then when there's some harm reduction or amelioration that's done to that one person, that all of a sudden becomes a win for the community as such, when it's not. Ain't no trickle down justice. Ain't no, you know what I'm saying? Ain't no trickle down tenure. And so I think that that's the other thing too about what we codify as moments and how we like manufacture them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's definitely true that there are times when, because I'm not where I am now is not where I once was. So there are times when the issues pop up online and it might be a window to learn more about something, depending on what it is. Like I think you make a good distinction, Dr. Seabass, between Cuba and a Dave Chappelle special, right? I think we can draw a clear line, but even with that, like, maybe you don't know anything about Black trans people. Maybe you carry the kind of line that Dave Chappelle was carrying in the special, and then you learn more. That's always a possibility. But I think that's just more of a consequence, but you still have to be organized and principled, because you just end up in a situation where I remember when Trump got in office and all of a sudden I saw people that were mad about issues that when Obama was doing, they didn't give a fuck, So like all of a sudden people had issues with charter schools, I remember, or all of a sudden y'all are against wars, all of a sudden.
Or vice versa. People had these huge issues about children in cages and immigration under Trump, and now no outrage, no outrage to be, it's fucking tumbleweeds, period. Yeah. So
you can't find them. So that's what I'm saying. Like, if it's not principled, that's what I'm saying. I don't think we're actually debating the issue that is on paper, because when a different person does it, or when it's in a different context, and all of a sudden, like you said, it's crickets. So that doesn't mean anything for whatever the issue is. If I can only find you when it's the person you don't like, or the person you like, or it's popular, or it's a trend, because these issues are ongoing. They are not trending, right? Like Black people are dying constantly, like Black trans people are under attack constantly. Haiti's been under attack for hundreds of years. Like, this isn't something that is just trending, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's not how any issue works. That's not dialectically possible, right? So it doesn't make sense to do that. I just think that's the stuff people need to think about. And also, you can't be involved in every issue. There's also this pressure to be like, well, I have to speak on this. And like, no, sometimes you really don't. Like, you ain't got to say nothing.
You can
like
shut the fuck up as
Yeah.
praxis.
Yeah.
Period. I agree. So I think the moral of the story is stop letting, go to celebrities for your entertainment and sports, cooking, whatever else it is that they do, but they are not our models for values, for politics, for any of that other shit. And so and likewise for our outrage, right? We don't need to waste our revolutionary energy trying to cancel this person, or if you want to individually boycott Dave Chappelle or whomever, fine. But I think that we have bigger fish to fry when it comes to actually making a structural and material and political difference. So
all right, y'all. So you all know how I feel about plants. And so we've decided to introduce a new segment on LDI, which we are going to call Planting Thoughts. And in this little short segment, I will feature a plant and something for us to think about, right? So today's plant is a Cereus rependus, or a Peruvian apple cactus. This is a baby version of the cactus, right? But this particular cactus is one of the largest growing cacti in the world. It can get up to 30 feet. It's interesting. It's called a Peruvian apple cactus, and the fruit that it bears looks like an apple. But I also am familiar with it because the Wayu people on the La Guaira Peninsula of Venezuela and Colombia also use this in some of their sort of construction materials to build certain things. But one of the things that I really find interesting about cacti, succulents in general, for me as a plant person, is the type of patience they require. One thing that I noticed when I started dealing with plants, I struggled with succulents in the beginning. And one of the things that I always said about succulents is that succulents require a certain type of neglect. But then I started to rethink that. And I also think that CBS and I are both people who we care about people, we're close to people, but we also need our alone time to recover, right? And so one of the things that I think cacti help me remember is that you can love a thing and you can care for a thing and not be so possessively invested in that thing, right? And so I think cacti in general help us to think about a kind of distance, not distance as in away from, but a type of love that allows you to be invested and care in the progress of a thing without meddling in it all the time, right?
You can loosen your grip.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so that is our plants for the week. And those are our thoughts, planting thoughts.
Yeah. All right, y'all. So for the rest of the episode, we want to talk about what's been happening since we've been gone, but also what's to come on this season of LDI. And so we want to address the elephant in the room first and foremost, and that is that LDI is on its own platform, the Lies Up Intellectual channel. We are no longer with Black Power Media. We won't say too much about this. And I'll speak at a particular level of abstraction because I just feel like that's how I roll. But we all went into Black Power Media with the utmost trust, excitement, and passion for that project. And I think we still very much sustain support for what Black Power Media has tried to do and is doing. But what can happen with the new venture is that you don't always have mechanisms in place for when internal conflicts or internal contradictions arise. And what I think when issues ultimately did arise, I think that what we discovered is that you cannot build the process as you're trying to go through it. You cannot establish rules for accountability while also trying to hold people accountable. Mm-hmm. And so I think that ultimately, while we still very much support and admire the project of Black Power Media, it just was not a sustainable relationship. And so we decided to not only leave the morning show, but to also just leave the platform in general and have Last Up Intellectual continue on independently.
I also think that one of the lessons that we learned in this process is that it is important for us in our organizations to not only think about the specific things that bring us together, but the possible things that will tear us apart, right? And which means that from the moment that we decide to enter into organizing spaces or communal projects, it is important to have conversations from the beginning about shared politics, right? And I think, and this is interesting because when I've talked to my dad about this a lot, this is often the difference between sort of coalitional politics and actually being involved in organizations, right? Because when you actually enter and engage into an organization, there is I think a greater presumption about a sort of shared type of politics. Whereas with coalitions, you tend to come together about one particular thing. But we're human beings. Sometimes we do fucked up shit. And sometimes we don't really realize the sort of domino effect or ramifications of those behaviors. And I think that if we want our entities to succeed, whether they be projects like Black Power Media, which I guess would be more akin to a sort of coalitional way of being, or our individual organizations, we have to take issues of sort of interpersonal relations and politics and sort of ethics, code of ethics, rules of engagement with one another serious from the beginning. And we cannot treat these things as sidebars, addendums. They are actually fundamental and foundational to the way we engage with one another, because we can't work on these sort of liberatory politics or projects as a group when we don't have that same kind of trust for and respect for one another. Right. And so I think that that's our sort of biggest takeaway from that.
Absolutely. And then I guess the final thing is just that it just seems like there's a lot of disintegration happening on the left, but also the Black left. And so in no way do we want to deter anything from Black Power Media. But this is the reality of the situation. And in terms of self-criticism, like, I know I need to continue to work on my revolutionary patience, period, and have trust for particular processes, even when they're not on my own timeline, and to be able to withstand changes in people's way of relating to each other without myself getting, stank, because it does happen. And just read up more and really think about what restorative justice means to me, to us, and have clear expectations, because we can't have moving goalposts in this, which I think can ultimately happen when there's not a shared understanding of what is and what should be. And so that's really all we have to say about that. We won't, Black Power Media, I'm sure they have their own particular perspectives and, might speak on it or not, but that's all we really have to say about it. So we won't mention it again, I'm certain. And, we have love and respect still for the overwhelming majority of members of Black Power Media.
In our efforts to learn from our, issues, things that come up, we do hope to have a conversation in the future in this season about restorative justice and sort of organizational practice, and just what it means to struggle. I mean, you talk about mutual comradeship, what it means to struggle with each other over issues that sometimes we have very fixed positions about, and sometimes we're still developing our positions about, right? And so, I think the best thing we can do is use this as a teachable moment.
So. In keeping with what has been going on since we've been gone, we just wanted to do a quick rundown of 10 events that have been happening nationally and globally that we've been paying attention to, that we want to speak on. And we're going to try to be brief, but you know us. So, the first is Jovenel Moise, right? And the situation, there's so much stuff going on around Haiti and Haitian asylum seekers. So as we know, on July 7th, Jovenel Moise was assassinated. And this was the first time a sitting Haitian president had been assassinated since 1915. And as we know, that ultimately led to a US invasion and occupation until 1934. And so this was sort of a uptick event in a long sort of months and months of struggle, strikes, and rejection of Jovenel Moise's presidency. And then his assassination was happening amidst an escalation of gang violence, like the massacre that happened in the Delmas 32 neighborhood, in which 19 people were killed, and then also among the protracted protests that was happening. And so it's just because of US imperialism, because of Western imperialism, occupation, and abdication of Haitian sovereignty, there was already a volatile situation, and that assassination is just one aspect of it. As if that weren't enough, a 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck on August 14th, which was followed by numerous aftershocks. And then Hurricane Grace hit. And so that exacerbated the sort of rescue and relief efforts. So ultimately over 2,000 people were killed, over 12,000 injured. And so that was just on top of the sort of social and political turmoil that was happening. There was this natural disaster that happened. And then, so I really recommend, if you want to know anything about Haiti, follow the writings and the interviews of Jemima Pierre, okay? Because that is my go-to person for what's happening on the ground. Also, Pascal Robert has interesting analysis as well. But in a particular article about linking the current earthquake to the previous one in 2010, Jemima Pierre wrote the following. She said, quote, Joe Biden's response to the earthquake was to put war hawk Samantha Power, who now heads USAID, in charge of US relief efforts in Haiti. Power, true to her long history of warmongering and in line with the US dealings with Haiti, announced that she would be working with Southcom and the Department of Defense to come up with a relief strategy. Meanwhile, it is only a matter of time before the foreign NGOs begin their fundraising to, quote, help Haiti. And so that was in a piece called, once again, Vultures Circle Haiti, and that was for Black Agenda Review. So as if that weren't enough, then within the context of the United States, the US began to operate as many as 7 deportation flights per day to remove more than 700 Haitian asylum seekers at a time from the Del Rio border area, where the US had begun reporting on September 18th that there was a migrant crisis, right? What they really did not emphasize is that these are asylum seekers, and these are people who are migrating not only directly from Haiti, but also from places in Central and South America from the initial displacement of 2010. And so that was an ongoing crisis, but for whatever reason, all of a sudden it became a big deal on September 18th. And then 2 days later, so that is September 20th, Biden began to move to get rid of all of the Haitians who were there and dismantle that camp on September 24th. And of course, used the Title 42 of the US Public Health Code to deport more than 7,000 Haitians, starting on September 19th. And that Title 42 is particularly notorious because it considered Haitians a high risk for COVID-19, despite the fact that they had relatively low numbers of COVID-19. And that's really the U.S. calling the pot, the kettle, the pot calling the kettle black to the motherfucker, because it's like we have the worst numbers in the world. So anyway,
yes.
It also, so Biden has decided to reinstate Trump's Remain in Mexico policy, which was one of the policies that helped to exacerbate this crisis in the first place. Not only that, prior to Trump's 2019 stay in Mexico policy was Obama's 2016 metering policy, which limited the number of asylum seekers who can enter into the US in the first place. And so it's a whole shit show. But it seems that most of the outrage, so there was talks of, dehumanization and humanitarian crises, but true to the shallowness of US politics, most people were outraged at these pictures of border patrolmen on horses whipping Haitians with the reins. And so then the US decided to take the border patrolmen off horses, I guess, because the horses were the problem. And so that is just the tip of the iceberg. The problem is the fact that the US is going and destabilizing Haiti over and over, has been occupying Haiti for decades, right? The fact that these people were summarily deported, right? That because Haitians particularly are Black, and first there was the assumption that they're all Haitian. Surely there were other populations, but also the swift deportation, despite the horrible conditions that I described just a second ago. And so it's complete fuckery, on par, if not worse, than what was happening with under Trump. And yet and still, the outcry has not been what it should be. So to end with Haiti, see, I do to make a short story long, right?
But we knew Haiti would be.
We knew Haiti would, and this is just scratching the surface. So of course we encourage you to keep looking into it. But Haiti, we always want to keep emphasizing Haiti because other places in the world get far more attention. But this situation is the pinnacle of neocolonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy. But the last thing I'll talk about with Haiti is that just a few days ago, 17 US and Canadian missionaries were kidnapped by gangs on Saturday. And the kidnappers ostensibly had made contact with the missionary organization. Now, interesting thing that CNN highlighted was that, kidnappings have increased exponentially in Haiti, but that of the 628 kidnappings since January, 29 have been foreigners. And yet most of what we hear about the kidnappings in Haiti are of foreign nationals, primarily US nationals. And so this just goes to show that the continued sort of denigration and imposition that characterizes the West's relationship to Haiti. And, we wish the missionaries a speedy return, but so anyway.
Do we though? No, no, I don't have anything substantial to add to that, except for the fact that I just don't understand why anybody is doing missionary trips of any kind in any place in 2021. Now we're moving to another island in the Caribbean, Cuba. So I think it'll probably be ongoing that we will always have some sort of update about what's happening between Haiti and Cuba. So shortly after Jovenel Moise was assassinated in Haiti, Cuba experienced a set of protests or uprisings, which became sort of known on social media as SOS Cuba, right? These were protests that ostensibly have come from, well, in general, COVID-19 has, the COVID-19 situation has created a sort of financial, economic downturn everywhere in the world, right? But the countries where the sort of economies were already struggling have felt it in a particularly harsh way, right? Mm-hmm. So and this is the case in Cuba, right? So because of COVID-19, the few ways that a number of Cuban citizens were able to receive sort of extra money above and beyond what the sort of standard packages are that were offered from the government comes from the sort of tourist industry, remittances. And so because of COVID, obviously tourism is down and remittances are sort of low. Now, there's a whole other conversation we can have about the tourist industry and remittances and the particular sort of racialized impact that it has on Afro-Cubans. Maybe we'll continue that at another point in time, but this is ostensibly what sort of leads to more and more sort of discontent in the Cuban case, right? And so these protests were sort of highly publicized because they were really the sort of biggest, even though they were not that large, but they were the biggest sustained protests in Cuba that have really sort of happened since the triumph of the revolution, right, that people have seen. But one of the things that really became interesting to me about that particular moment were there was a set of arguments that sort of came out at that particular time from some Afro-Cubans who were located, Afro-Cuban women in particular, located in Haiti. And so then there comes this sort of false outrage about the condition or life of Afro-Cubans at this moment in COVID, right? The thing is, in spite of the blockade, in spite of the sort of economic downturn, Cuba has continued to maintain one of the best sort of COVID responses, right? To this day, I think something like there have been like, and not to minimize any deaths, but there's been something like 8,000 deaths in Cuba, right? Whereas we are well over 500,000 deaths in the US. Now, obviously, we know the population numbers are different, but that is substantial.
R.I.P. Colin Powell.
We'll come back to that. But in this moment, you know, one of the things that happens in the sort of tourist industry in Cuba is that there's a lot of sex trafficking that disproportionately, sex trafficking and sex tourism that disproportionately impacts Afro-Cubans. What's interesting about this is that this was even the case prior to the triumph of the revolution, right? So prior to 59, under Batista, Cuba was like a fucking gangster's paradise, right? People were going there to spend money and buy women and all these things, right? And in this moment, Black Lives Matter gets criticized for continuing to, Black Lives Matter as a larger entity, for continuing to sort of offer support for Cuba and the Cuban government at this particular moment. And then this kind of gets spun on its head as anti-Afro-Cuban in some type of way. And I really found these arguments to be quite disingenuous, because so much of the sort of disproportionate impact of what is happening in Cuba continues to be a result of the blockade, a result of the embargo, because the sort of period in Cuba when people sort of claim to be in a sort of great period was prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And that racial tensions sort of had all but disappeared, and that when the Soviet Union collapsed, these sort of racial tensions resurfaced, and the tourist industry had to return, all these different things had to return. And these sort of re-exacerbated these kind of racialized and gender tensions inside of the country. And so I think that one of the things that we always have to be careful about when we hear the perspectives of people from certain places, one, we have to think about their locale, sort of what their objectives are, what's important to them, and who they're really speaking on behalf of. And I think for me, with Cuba in particular, and this is the same with Venezuela for me, the case is always that the Cuban people are able to determine what it is they need, and that they are not able to realize that in a real way as long as the blockade continues. And so what's interesting about this moment in the blockade is that Cuba also now has 5 COVID vaccine candidates, but the 2 that are sort of most have moved the farthest in their trials are the Soberana 2, which with 2 shots at the moment has like a 62% efficacy, and the Abdullah, which with 3 shots has a 93% efficacy rate. And these are on par with these other big, you know, Moderna, Johnson, not Johnson, not say Johnson, Pfizer. And this is interestingly an ongoing case. So Venezuela was one of the first countries to receive, I think it was like a batch of 30,000 of these vaccines from Cuba. But again, the blockade in particular is making it difficult to continue to test the efficacy and spread these vaccines, all while the US and the West are continuing to hoard vaccines, right, as they move towards a 3rd shot. So in a nutshell, that's Cuba at the moment.
So next we have Ethiopia. So there's so much going on with the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia. So of course, as we know, the Abiy government called a ceasefire in June, but the fighting is still ongoing. There was a TPLF offensive subsequent to the ceasefire. Of course, the U.S. is trying to get the UN. So on August 26th, there was a meeting of the UN Security Council. The U.S. was trying to get the Security Council to vote on to sanction Ethiopia. So a verbal censure. And Russia and China were blocking this move because they were saying that it's largely an internal matter that the UN Security Council does not need to intervene in. The US on September 18th approved a new sanctions regime to be imposed unless, quote, unfettered humanitarian access is allowed, end quote. So this is based on accusations on both sides, that both the Ethiopian government side and TPLF side are hindering UN humanitarian aid for coming for their own particular reasons. Of course, the Western media tends to cover it only when they're able to condemn the Ethiopian government, but there's far less coverage in terms of critiques of TPLF. Some argue because TPLF is a sort of Western aligned, Western puppet regime, or puppet, is aligned with the interests of the West. I'm not there, I don't know, do with that what you may. But as all of this is happening, Abiy appointed a new cabinet in early October. That is supposed to be notable because it's more inclusive. So there's opposition people who he included inside the government. Even as he's still moving to privatize many of the sort of beleaguered state enterprises. And so it's a very complicated situation in Ethiopia. And of course, there are huge factions within the Ethiopian Eritrean diaspora about what's going on. And so always our stance is we're against US imperialism, we're against Western imperialism and the way the West is using this conflict, number one, to impose its own will, and number two, to punish a country like Eritrea in particular, who is the only country on the African continent that does not have relationship with AFRICOM. So that is always our position. And then another sort of notable update is that 7 senior UN officials were expelled from Ethiopia by the Abiy government for unduly trying to intervene in internal affairs. And so always when these conflicts happen and the West intervenes, it's always to dictate to global South countries, to developing countries. And this is what we're against, because even as there's atrocities on both sides in the Tigray conflict, the US is never on anybody's side but its own side. And so we can never lose sight of that. So that's Ethiopia.
And jumping from the east to the south. So there's a lot of shit that popped up in July. So in July, Jacob Zuma was finally in South Africa, Jacob Zuma was finally brought to trial for some of the accusations of corruption that were launched against him during his presidency. And in early July, he refused to sit for or testify in front of the Zondo Commission, and was subsequently imprisoned or for contempt of court. And what happens after this is that so they were described as the most widespread and destructive and deadly protests in South Africa since the end of the apartheid regime. So in that moment, I think the earliest protests broke out in KwaZulu-Natal, which is where Durban is located, and they spread to the Gauteng province, which is where Johannesburg is located. What's interesting about what happened with Jacob Zuma and these protests is that they are largely, again, in the same way that the protests were fueled by this kind of particular economic precarity caused by COVID-19. The same thing was happening in South Africa, right? So the generation in South Africa that were born post-apartheid are known as the born frees, right? And so they are people that are, for the most part, I guess at this point, under 25, I think, yeah. Mm-hmm. And South Africa is a country that has historically had a very high youth unemployment rate, but over the course of since 2019, that number has soared to almost 60% at different points in time, right? So imagine a country where more than 40% of the population is under the age of 25 and almost 60% of that population is unemployed, right? And so when we see the growing discontent with the rainbow coalitional politics of the ANC, the moment that Jacob Zuma refuses to stand trial for his own charges of corruption, not that Cyril Ramaphosa is a much better candidate either, you see this response and this backlash, right? And so one of the things that was really interesting to me while I was in South Africa was understanding, not justifying, but understanding the particular way that it's not even just xenophobia, but it's a particular kind of Afrophobia that exists, which is akin to the US-Mexican relations, right? These populations of people that cross the border into South Africa for work that are able to be employed from Zimbabwe and other places, right? And even Nigeria become targeted by the youth. And that is really a misdirected discontent, right? And so we have to always be critical and think about what are these structural issues that are causing this particular kind of moment, right? In the case of South Africa, we will continue to watch the situation and we'll probably return to it at some point.
Going from south to the west side, Mali. Okay, so not only was there a coup earlier in the year in Mali, but recently what has been in the news is that Mali is in conversation with a private Russian mercenary firm called the Wagner Group to sort of replace French troops. So the French have decided a few months ago to cut their troop presence from 5,000 to about 2,500 in Mali. And so, of course, the French are up in arms about this negotiation, as are the Germans, the UK, and the United States poke their protruding nose into everything. And so essentially what they're warning against ostensibly is that the Wagner group is a driver of conflict, especially in the Central African Republic and in Libya. Now, if anybody is actually concerned about Libya, they really will be making critiques of AFRICOM and the United States and its role in fundamentally destabilizing Libya, which, as we know, has led to open air slave markets and much other instability. And so this just attests to the disingenuousness and uneven nature of the critique of the West. But this deal between Mali and the Wagner Group was also condemned by ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of West African States. And of course, France and other groups are threatening to withdraw aid. They're saying that the presence of Russian mercenaries will jeopardize Mali's funding in general from not only France, but its international partners, and the continuation of training the Malian forces. And essentially this deal boiled down to the Wagner Group will be paid about what amounts to $10.8 million a month for its services. So one security force argued that in the region, the mercenaries would both train the Malian government and also protect senior officials. And so this raises, and of course, the presence and the fear is about growing terrorism in the region. And so this raises a number of issues about, the war on terror, questions of sovereignty, the way that aid is used as a bludgeon, so like the carrot and the stick model, and what room sovereign African or global South nations actually have to control their own affairs. And there's more information about the withdrawal of French troops from Mali on the channel of African Esquire, especially. So she has an episode called French Military Leaving Africa, Why Now? And so I highly recommend that particular episode to get more context on this. But again, this is an ongoing situation. And so we'll continue to be reporting back on what's going on.
And speaking of French collusion and US French collusion, there was also a coup in Guinea, late summer, right? So September. Mm-hmm. In September, I forget, it was the year before, I think, Alpha Conde, the previous president of Guinea Conakry, had changed the constitution in order to be able to allow himself to run for a third term, which the people were not in support of, right? And so also the thing that's interesting about these coups and the politics of following that is that they're very difficult to suss out sometimes, because there are interesting issues that are happening both with the regimes that are displaced and the regimes that come mm-hmm. into power, right? So the person, Mamadi Doumbouya, who leads this military coup against Alpha Conde, was previously recruited by Alpha Conde to actually help his own sort of military projects. I think Doumbouya is the youngest or the second youngest person to lead an African country at the moment. I think he's like 41 years old. But what's really important about, again, the kind of politics of this moment is that Doumbouya is both has these sort of AFRICOM, French military connections. And so when we look at the politics of this coup, we can see squarely on both sides that neither Conde in the sort of previous moment nor Doumbouya in this moment are necessarily people that are coming to power or that are dealing, while they have power, with the general interest of the people, right? And I think, what is it? So between Mali, Guinea, and Chad, right? Mm-hmm. There are 3 French affiliated military coups that have happened on the African continent in 2021 alone. Mm. Again, ongoing situation. We'll continue to watch developments.
Period. And then to the good old US. So of course, there's been all sorts of stuff popping off here, I just wanted to quickly touch on, there's the infrastructure bill on the one hand and the Build Back Better bill, as well as the controversy over the debt ceiling. And so the vote on the infrastructure bill was supposed to happen in early October. The progressive flexed their meager muscles and were like, no, we're not going to vote on this infrastructure bill until there is more of a consensus reached on the so-called Build Back Better bill, which is a social programs bill. Of course, raggedy ass mansion and dizzy ass cinema are the two that are pushing back on the price tag of the Build Back Better bill. After how soon we forget that the infrastructure bill was already pared down, because that started off much bigger and then it was narrowed down to 1.5 trillion, despite the fact that the US is crumbling. Okay, something like 60%, there's like 60% of bridges, roads, inability to respond to climate change induced flooding, fires, and other disaster. But here we are. So the Build Back Better bill is the social programming bill. There's provisions in there for that are around health, expanding Medicare, around expanding Social Security, making community college free, a lot about childcare. I think the most comprehensive childcare provisions that have been considered ever. And because this bill is for the people, naturally, the question is about how much it costs. Never is a question about how much the quote unquote defense budget, which is the aggression budget, costs. There was no pushback about spending even more money, sending more money to Israel for their Iron Dome. Of course, there was the whole, speaking of celebrity culture, the influencer AOC and her crying about. Anyway, so never is there a question about cost for those things, but always when it comes to social, to anything that's meant to benefit the people, cost is always a problem because we ain't supposed to get shit. We're just supposed to die and shut up, right? And this is not even addressing the fact that the large price tag only scratches the surface of the social problems that we face. So that's notwithstanding. But the thing I did want to touch on is the way that the debt ceiling is being used to extract immiseration for the people by way of using, potential US default, which I don't think any party will actually let the US default on its debt because of the global ramifications of that, but it's used as a bludgeon to cut budgets, right? To pare down any the already meager provisions for poor people. And interestingly, the use of the debt ceiling used to be relatively uncontroversial, lifting the debt ceiling, but it was starting in 2011 under Obama that the Republicans in particular began to use the debt ceiling in that way. That is to say, to cut the federal budget. And so that the debt ceiling has been temporarily lifted, but McConnell and the other ghouls are trying to force the Democratic Party to use reconciliation to raise the debt ceiling as opposed to a straightforward vote, which again has political, it's all politics. And the moral of that story is that things that used to be sort of just happenstance, political, politics in the interest of the country are now being used as political tools. And the people who ultimately lose out are poor people. I don't know if you remember a few years ago when the government shut down, that means people don't get their Social Security checks. It means people don't get their food stamps. It means people who work for the government don't get paychecks, they get furloughed. And so it's always people, even though this is just politics and baby town frolics for politicians, but it has real life ramifications for people. And so this month is a very crucial month for what's going to happen with both of these bills. And also we're leading into the 2022 midterm elections. And if the Democrats are unable to pull this off, I think they're going to lose big in the midterm elections anyway. So they're going to look even more incompetent and and weak than they already are. So that's just some of what's happening in the United States right now.
And what else is happening in the US? The US has been forced out of Afghanistan, right?
Yeah, so, essentially what there is to say about that is that the United States has been, we have left Afghanistan. It was a shit show. There was a attack at the Kabul airport, which then led to the US doing a drone attack that killed civilians. There's still, Afghanis are being, still seeking asylum in the United States and other places. The situation is getting more dire, but, both parties are trying to both condemn Biden, but also tout particular types of victories for pulling out of Afghanistan. This is imperialism, plain and simple. We never should have been there. So leaving Afghanistan was absolutely necessary. But what it signals is a pivot to the Indo-Pacific, repositioning of resources to AFRICOM and Southcom. And so it's not as if this is the end of US imperialism. It's simply a new beginning. Exactly. So, and then relatedly, this is the Black Alliance for Peace, my organization, no compromise, no retreat, a month of awareness, bringing awareness to AFRICOM, which was founded on October 1st, 2008. And since its founding, 46 various forms of US bases, as well as military to military relations have been established between 53 out of 54 African countries and the United States. As well, US Special Forces troops now operate in more than a dozen African countries. There's so much more to be said about the devastation that has been wrought by AFRICOM. But for BAP's International Month of Action Against AFRICOM, our organization seeks to raise the public's awareness about the US military's existence in Africa and how the presence of US forces exacerbates violence and instability throughout the continent. And this is increasingly important because, as we sort of mentioned earlier, the new frontier for the war on terror is the African continent. And so more and more resources and more specifically military outposts will continue to pour into the African continent if we don't do something about this. And so on October 1st, there was a webinar called AFRICOM at 13, Building the Popular Movement for Demilitarization and Anti-Imperialism in Africa. And so if you can go to BAP's website and check out the recording for that webinar. And then just this past Sunday, BAP Atlanta had an AFRICOM teach-in. Sunday, October 24th, BAP Chicago is doing an AFRICOM teach-in. On October 26th, BAP LA is doing a political education session on AFRICOM, amongst many other events that are happening. So check out that AFRICOM calendar, or the BAP AFRICOM calendar on the website. And the other thing that I wanted to point out that BAP has really emphasized is that the Congressional Black Caucus needs to speak out against AFRICOM, right? The Black Alliance for Peace calls on all Congressional Black Caucus members to speak out against the U.S. Africa Command, and demands the program's abolition and a shift of funds to the communities they represent. And so, even though the CBC espouses to represent the largely struggling majorities in Black communities, they continually rubber stamp the Pentagon's funding of not only the defense budget, but also programs like 1033, as well as AFRICOM. And so we need to hold our influencers / elected representatives accountable to really push back against AFRICOM, especially those who say that they are acting in the interest of African people. So US out of Africa, AFRICOM out of Africa, period.
And for our final sort of piece of what happened while we were away, is that the community, or CLAC, the Community for Latin American and Caribbean States, had their first meeting since 2017, the last one which was in the Dominican Republic. And one of the things that has come out of this is an attempt by Mexico to aid in the negotiations between sort of renormalizing a type of political relationship between the US and Venezuela, which has picked up since Biden has been elected, which is basically all but dropped while Trump was in office. But one of the things that has made this stall is that Alex Saab, who Maduro argues was on a sort of diplomatic humanitarian mission, was stopped in Cape Verde and was then they've essentially extradited him to make him stand trial. And the US believes that Alex Saab will be able to offer the most damaging or comprehensive and devastating testimony that will lead to proof that the Venezuelan government has been complicit in types of some sort of corruption and misappropriation of funds since Chavez came to power, right? Since the sort of Bolivarian revolution has worked. And so at the moment, Maduro and Venezuela has decided to pull out of these sort of negotiation talks with the US because they don't believe that they're happening on sort of fair and just terms, which they have no reason to believe that they're not. But it is interesting to see this moment across Latin America where the sort of the pink tide is rising again, right? And we see a return to a left kind of politics. And I think again, this is another place where we just have to keep watching.
Period. So that was the rundown, y'all. So of course, there's so much information that we did not cover. We were trying to do it quick, rapid, fast, as much as we could, but these are just things that we have been paying attention to since the end of season 1 of LDI, and that we'll continue to pay attention to, continue to talk about and think about, and hope that you'll be following as well.
All right, so I've been watching. I watched pretty much all of LDI season 1, and I don't think I've ever seen y'all in the same room together, even though y'all say you're best friends.
Because you don't watch the brunches because you a hater, but that's cute. You're right. You're right.
I mean, I don't know why anybody would do that. But you set yourself up for that one. But so for the actual real episodes, I've never seen y'all I've never seen y'all in the same room together, so it's just interesting. So what y'all gonna be on this season, and where do you mind disclosing where y'all actually are, or would you like to keep that private?
Oh yeah, we forgot.
Cool.
Yeah,
so
we in London.
Fancy ass CBS over here. She had 2 talks last week. So she had a talk at the University of Chicago Center in Paris and the University of Lille. And so, as you guys know, or may not know, I'm in Germany for the year on fellowship. And so I decided to come support her. And then we decided to take advantage of this to actually record season 1 together in the same room.
And by season 1, we mean episode 1, season 2.
Yeah.
We know what you meant, you know. So yeah, so right now we're in London, just living our best life. So we'll go to Amsterdam next. We're doing just a little short European tour, a lot of paperwork. Do not recommend, but we're having fun.
That actually, listen, traveling in COVID has been a shit show for real. But the UK in particular, which allows us to talk about this fuckery of Brexit, right? It is fairly easy to travel within the European Union, as long as you're either COVID negative or vaccinated or whatever. But because of Brexit, there are many different hurdles and things we have to jump to move in and out of England or London from elsewhere in the European Union that was not previously the case. And one of the things has been that, so we're in London for 4 days. And if you're in London, coming from certain countries, depending on your vaccination status, you have to take a day 2 COVID test. Now, we are now on day 2. You have to order a COVID test before you can even arrive. You have to prove that you've ordered it, whether you're going to go to the clinic or if you're going to take it privately. And they're supposed to ship it to you if you have a ship, and you're supposed to take it and send it back. We're on day 2. I have not even received my test yet. And so when I did not receive my test, I started Googling, right? And I recognized that there are a number of people who are having this problem. And these tests are not cheap now. These tests are, the cheapest ones are like 2 or 3 euros, but some of the more expensive ones are over 100 euros. And a number of people have been ordering these tests, and their ability to move, whether they're students, whether they're people working, is dictated by whether or not they get these tests. And essentially what it comes down to is that this is an economic racket, right? To this charging people for tests, because I think there's like a day 2 and a day 8 test. And again, it depends on where you're coming from. And I don't actually know. And I think there's even there potentially a 2,000 euro fine if I don't take the test. So I don't really know what we're going to be up against when we leave. But essentially, this is that right-wing Brexit shit that's making it difficult to travel throughout Europe.
So it sounds like y'all damn near quarantining, even though you didn't.
We're not. We out here, period. But it's just a nuisance. So yeah. So anyway, that's what we on. That's where we at.
Okay, so what's the
for the upcoming season? What do y'all have in mind? Like, I know y'all have talked to various scholars, artists, activists in season 1. Is it gonna be a similar tone for this season, or would it be more of a broader range of the different people you want to talk to. You want to talk to some white people for once. Like, what's kind of the idea?
Y'all. Yes. Okay, y'all. So we can actually start with that. So something we're contemplating is if we want to have like a non-Black segment. Y'all know that while on the morning show, there was a variety of people, but on my show, Lies Up Intellectual, it's been all Black and all Black left, at least left progressive, right? But there's some people who are with the shits that we want to talk to, right? And of course, there is still a difference between like non-Black, but then also non-white. So people like Nick Esty, Steven Salida, we've been thinking about talking about, but we're considering. There's some, white left folks that have good things to say. And so we're considering a segment that is the non-Black segment to talk to different people. So
we'd be interested to maybe even hear what you all have to say about that. I mean, as we've discussed it, I think obviously there are plenty of people on the question of indigenous native rights, the question of Palestine in particular. And again, there are white lefties who are doing good work, right? And so, I mean, I think that it is, as intellectuals, it is important to be in conversation with those and to also be able to, I think, shape a conversation that continues to take seriously the predicament of Blackness, right? Mm. Again, Jamila Pierre, that's her first book, The Predicament of Blackness. But I think we're just trying to figure out like how we want to actually frame that, right? Given the kind of precedent that was set in season 1. But I mean, I'm with it. I think that there are definitely conversations that we can have with certain people, and we can continue to not give other people a platform.
Mm-hmm. So what whites do you want to talk to?
I thought you was asking me. I was like, I don't have
but well, for me in particular, one person that I'm thinking about is George Chigarillo Mayer. In one regard, because as a person who does work on Venezuela, I think is it either 3 or 4 books that he's written on Venezuela, but he's also got a new book on A World Without Police, right? And so as we think about the kind of ongoing conversations around abolitionism, and also, I mean, from what I know of Gio, he is an academic, but he also faced some backlash from some comments that he made and actually lost an academic appointment at Drexel, but also has been really fairly active in organizations beyond the sort of academy. So for me, that would be the type of person that I would want to have on the show for, our sort of non-Blacks.
So maybe, something that we're absolutely going to do is every third episode, we want to do a sort of reading focused or thematically focused episode. And so whether it is that we're talking to an author of a particular book, so we definitely at some point want to talk to Derricka Purnell about becoming abolitionist, but we definitely want every third episode of this season to be doing a deep dive into a reading, whether it's a book, an article, something like that, so that, because, if we take studies seriously, we also want us to be able to do it in community. That's also important. And so with you all, we'll let you know what book or reading we'll be discussing, and then we'll set up the show around really focusing in on whatever that is. So we think that would be cool.
I mean, and I think another thing we've talked a lot about for season 2 is a way to increase viewer engagement. And so I think with the book clubs, with soliciting questions, even now, just asking you all, who might you want to see on the show this season? I mean, obviously we have thoughts, we have a plan for the season, but we definitely want to kick it to you all and see what you want to hear.
Yeah. So in terms of, there's a whole bunch of people that we want to have on. We have a couple people who have tentatively confirmed. So we got Bob Brown.
Yes, we have my uncle, Bob Brown, who he's got a new book, We Demand the Full Disclosure and Digitization of All Slavery Era Records. The new book is volume 2, with the first book, volume 1 came out a few years ago, which is essentially a compilation of primary source documents that have been used in this sort of ongoing case for reparations, right? And what's interesting about the way this sort of book is put together is that he filed a number of lawsuits against the city of Oakland, the city of Chicago, for reparations, a number, all of which were sort of rejected on the basis that what do you call it, a private citizen could not file these lawsuits, right? And so that begs and asks certain questions about the not the efficacy, but
the ability. How do we get redress? Who can petition for these things? But the broader project too of that is digitizing slavery records, right? And so that they're accessible, and so that people can not only study but also can perhaps file class action lawsuits and use this data to continue the ongoing struggle for reparations.
So that one's definitely coming.
That one's coming. Treva Lindsay has a book called America Goddamn that's coming out. And Treva's really interesting because she's a well-renowned as a feminist scholar, but has also been increasing her sort of anti-capitalist and class analysis. And so it'll be interesting to talk to her about that.
So a friend, Olivia Rutazibwa, who is a Rwandan Belgian scholar who largely does work on international relations, but one of the things that her book project in progress is particularly on Black epistemicide, right? And so thinking about what it means to confront sort of Black ways of knowing and being in the world, and these projects that have intentionally engaged in doing away with those, right? So we talk about the kind of physicality of genocide, but I think that this question about epistemicide is one that's particularly interesting and pertinent in this moment. Another that I really want to invite is Nyasha Mboti, who's is a scholar in South Africa, and he is largely working on a project to build apartheid studies. And I think that being able to have a conversation within the framework of apartheid studies is an interesting confluence of the sort of condition of Black people in the US, the kind of Palestinian question, and the South African question. So I think that would be perfect for the types of things that we're sort of interested in thinking about on the show.
We also want to have a number of people back that we had on last season. So Eugene Puryear, Derica Purnell, Baina Muhammad, Crystal Strong, Gerald Horn, the homie, right, the genius in residence, and of course Erica Keynes and the Hood Communist Crew. So we would love to have them on, as well as, if Too Black is with it, we want to have a little Black Myths recap segment to have Too Black and his crew talk about, to feature what they've been doing on their show, which is such an interesting show. There's no show like it where, they work Too Black can just explain his show better than I. I've been on it though, so I'm invested. But anyway, debunking popular myths and having people, whether it's panels or individuals, talk about a variety of issues that are in the popular discourse that are often misunderstood. So that would be dope.
For sure. You all know that for me, the plans and sort of thinking about a kind of a politics of self-care that is not rooted in a sort of neoliberal individualism is something that I think I would like for us to have conversations about. And so in that regard, I'd like to have Stephanie Y. Evans come on, and even Vivette Jeffries, who is an Indigenous woman who works largely on restorative justice projects. And so I think it's important for us to think about the context of self-care beyond this sort of commodified way of thinking about, buying products for ourselves and sitting alone in places.
Getting massages,
exactly.
Bubble baths.
Yes. And so I definitely want to have those conversations. Kambale Muzavuli, who has been interviewed, I think, in different contexts across BPM and other places, but I mean, just a wealth of knowledge, and also another a person that's much more activist oriented, I think is important to have on.
And then, we both have been on a number of podcasts, and so it would be cool to, reciprocate that and have some people on. So one person in particular, recently I was on Brianna Joy Gray's show. And so she said she would like to come on and speak about, I think that she's much more into mainstream American politics than we are. And so it'll be interesting to get her perspective. As well as, we talked about dating, dating while radical. So just, anyway.
we do this season want to introduce some slightly lighthearted segments, which we'll come to talk about a little bit later on, which I'm excited about.
Yeah. So anyway, so those are just some of the people that we want to talk to, and so in terms of other segments, one that we thought about was what Netflix and Trill.
Yes.
So Netflix and Trill will be where we watch some show. I'm not super into popular culture or whatever, but I never watch what everybody watching because I don't want to be part of the conversation. But there might be older new things that we might watch and then just have a particular type of discussion about, obviously rooted in politics, obviously rooted in our own Black left analysis. Because that's what turns me off about Black culture, that it can be so vapid when it's discussed. And so, but there are ways to talk about cultural artifacts, right? In ways that are more relevant and, better. So that's one thing, so we might throw that in the mix a couple times.
You're about to watch Insecure or something?
Yeah, right. She already watch Insecure.
I do. I don't care. Trust me if you won't. I don't give a shit.
Nah, I mean, I watch. That's one of the shows I will watch just to keep up, so I'm not completely alienated from Black people.
But to be honest, for me, sometimes
not that bad of a show. But
it's not that bad. It actually got worse, but it was a little bit better in the beginning. But sometimes for me, it's literally just about looking at Black people. Sometimes I just be tired of looking at white people. And one of the things that is interesting that we could talk about in the case of Insecure in particular was the politics of lighting and filming of dark skin, because that was one thing that they talked a lot about in the show, was that as sort of pictures and cameras developed over time, they really were developed to light and highlight white skin. And so there is a particular visual aesthetic in Insecure that does highlight dark skin in a way. And I think that these are things that are important for us.
Yeah, when I was in college, I mean, I went to school for videography, and I remember I asked a question about that, and they told me straight up, it was a white dude. I think he was white, or at least he thought he was white. And he told me that, I asked him, because we were going over lighting, and I was like, is there a difference? And he was like, he told me no, like, it doesn't matter. It'll show up the same way. And as I've done it, like, and I've never been the greatest at lighting, but as y'all can see, even with my camera right now, but I understood, like, no, there's a certain depth that you have to even have. I don't want to get too technical to even like show Black skin on screen, or it's gonna look flat. And if you shine too much on it, it's gonna look ashy, So to make it actually have a sheen to it, that is something they do get well.
Yep.
It's the same with makeup too. Yeah. In another time in my life, I was really into makeup and makeup artistry.
I am now.
And so, like putting foundation with sunscreen in it, right? Preventing flashbacks. Yeah. So you can't put particular types of powder. That's on everybody in general, but it's particularly pronounced on Black people. And you've seen the Black people that they got a makeup artist that does not know how to do makeup on Black people, and it shows. And you just like, why you do that? Hair too. Anyway,
like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer in that bitch.
Period. So anyway, so these are all issues, right, that might come with the sort of Netflix and Trill type of discussion.
Since the show is called The Last Dope Intellectual, obviously this is intellectual curiosity is one of the features of the show. So is there anything that you're intellectually curious about, either one of you, like any topics or any ideas that you're wrestling with? I know people, both of y'all have work that's already ongoing. So is there anything you're interested in covering on the show in that nature?
That's interesting, because even as we were getting ready for the show today, CBS, who wants you all to know that she should definitely be in line for a MacArthur grant, was
they just giving them out apparently. So run me my 750, period.
But one of the questions that she asked, that we were having a conversation about, was thinking about the way that toxic masculinity is framed, and if it is that toxic masculinity has historically really been framed, particularly as it relates to Black men. And so there was like a picture that she showed me of these 3 Black men, one of whom was like braiding hair, one was laying in the bed, like they were smoking. And it was like, and I think the caption was something like reframing masculinity. I can't talk today. And I think the question you asked me was, what exactly?
No, okay. Okay, you got to edit some of this shit out. Well, so what I asked was the first thing was, okay, if it is that, and it was based on what somebody had commented, it seemed that the only time that masculinity needs to be reimagined or redefined is in relationship to the way that Black men are masculine, right? And then the second question, and then we got into a conversation about white feminism. And it seemed to us that white feminism was not really about masculinity. It was about patriarchy and whether or not white women can participate in, and about them pushing back against femininity. But it seemed that perhaps, and our hypothesis was maybe that Black feminists had introduced the interrogation of masculinity into the discourse, which then would be vis-a-vis Black men. So anyway, so one broad topic would be masculinity, gender, and of course, from a racialized, radical perspective.
Tommy Curry has some good work on toxic masculinity, the origins of that, and how a lot of that was, if I'm understanding it correctly, was white people trying to distance themselves from a certain type of masculinity that was associated with Black men. What's interesting though is he talks about as well, like masculinity, Black men weren't even considered masculine for a large period of time. And then this idea gets introduced later on. But the origins of a lot of these ideas were actually very racist.
White sociology. Yeah, we can have him on the show. I know Tommy. So anyway, but yeah, so that's one topic. The second topic is probably, or an ongoing theme, is like Pan-Africanism, because people really try to act like Pan-Africanism is some passe shit, like, you know, like it's the Betamax. And we like, nah, it's not, right? And so like, what is a Pan-African perspective, and why it is that it's still relevant, right? Because our analysis is always already from a Pan-African perspective. But you know, it's interesting, there was another tweet that was talking about Black Americans benefit the least from Pan-Africanism. So like debunking goofy shit like that. And just, you know, I think that we have a Pan-African analysis in real time, which is why we have the perspectives that we have. And so that's another theme that we're interested in.
Which also ties into the question about reparations, right? And who deserves reparations from whom and how, right? And how we have those arguments about deservedness or whatever. So I mean, I think that we'll probably touch on that. We will touch on that conversation in our interview with Bob Brown, but I think that there are even broader ways to have that conversation.
You know, of course, the main shit, anti-capitalism, and then what is the other side of that? Communism, socialism, some type of revolutionary intercommunalism, whatever, right? You know, so always that's going to be an ongoing theme of what we talk about. And I think that too, part of the reason why we're thinking about having non-Black folks on is because we do want to have more conversations about like Black and Indigenous relationships, and how some of that work has been done piss poorly. But what does that actually look like, right? What does it mean to have a Black critique of settler colonialism that is in conversation with and in communion with Indigenous scholars and Indigenous activists, thinkers, organizers, etc. So that's another thing. Yeah,
because I think even in terms of disaggregating the Black left, right? There are different configurations of what people think are Black left. And, you know, for me, the kind of what do you call it? The Black Belt thesis, the kind of new African Republic, I find to be a problematic one as a Pan-Africanist, because making certain types of claims on the land in a place where we are not the indigenous people, and then there are all kinds of arguments about that too, I think it's something that has to be talked about, discussed, debated, disaggregated. So that's important for me in that conversation, being in conversation with Indigenous scholars and activists and Palestinian scholars and activists.
So as a previous consumer of Last Dope Intellectual, what are some things that you want to hear super smart, super dope Black intellectual women, or, you know, men and other people too, talk about?
Well, you had mentioned that the anti-capitalism. This is a question I always have in my head when people say they're anti-capitalist, but they don't want to claim that they're socialists or communists or so what are you? That's just a question. I'm not saying you can't have a stance there. I'm just saying I think it seems to be a weird gap where like I'm anti-capitalist, but I don't want to be associated with anything red. It just seems kind of weird to me. But I might be wrong, but I know that, you know, y'all have expertise in that. So I'd just be interested in seeing that conversation kind of dealt with. You had talked about the black belt thesis, or even the idea of new Africans or whatever. That would be an interesting conversation. Even if it was a debate, just to see how that plays out. I don't know. I guess you were talking about Netflix and chill, and I know CBS, you do work on
Netflix and Trill.
Netflix and Trill. But I know you do work on the anti-communism, but it's like when you watch stuff, sometimes you could literally just do a red baiting section on that, because it just be all in the stuff, you know, like you watch it, just like, wow, like this isn't a movie, but there's this, I think it's some type of play right now. It's actually a Naps at Butler, and it's China. It's called China Before Communism. Like they're actually doing an entire play on that, and they're uplifting it, you know. So, and it's just, this stuff is just so normalized, and you're
like
just kind of
propaganda.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the way these things just show up would be interesting conversation too.
So anyway, so that's what you can expect for season 2. So it's a lot of the same that we were doing in season 1, but just obviously since we have some new voices, new analysis, just, you know, spicing it up, adding a little bit more. So
sure.
Tap in.
So one of the new things that we are also doing this season, because we are independent, is we have established a Patreon. Now we have kind of agonized over what to do with the Patreon, how to set it up, and so bear with us. So we have established 4 tiers for our Patreon: dope, hella dope, super dope, and dope as fuck. If you look at the visuals on the Patreon, we wanted to make it clear. Now, so CBS asked this, and I kind of said, you know, we can have tiers that don't necessarily reflect any kind of qualitative value with anyone, but I guess there are questions about that when you see these. So our thinking with the tiers was that we had in each of these tiers, we have pictures of activist intellectuals from across the sort of Black African diasporic world, and they just correspond to the numbers that they are, right? So there's 1 in the first one, there's 2 in the second one, there's 3 in the third, and there's 4 in the fourth, right? But the thing about the Patreon for us is that it's not necessarily that important to monetize it for us, but we do want to practice what we preach in terms of our politics. And so we do want to be able to offer our producer, Too Black, a fair wage. And so the majority of the proceeds of our Patreon will go to supporting his efforts to produce and edit the show. And if by some miracle we end up generating a bunch of funds, we'll figure out something beyond that. But that's not really our goal. Our goal is to be self-sustaining, is to be able to be independent, self-sustaining, and produce quality work for you all.
And you know, if she need a mic and a ring light, so like stuff like that. But it's like, you know, that's the point of the Patreon, and just so that we can have our, you know, have our community together. And so but we have the show is free. We have free content. There's just a few other perks for persons who are willing to kick in each month, and we do appreciate that. So we hope that some of you or all of you will become patrons.
Yeah. And with that, we have also established independent social media for the show. At the moment, we just have a Twitter and Instagram, which are
LDI Podcast. At LDI Podcast. All right, y'all. So now for another recurring segment, what we on. So formerly what I'm on, now what we on. And so we are both on fellowship. So Dr. Brown, tell us about your fellowship this year.
Lord. Okay. So I am a senior research fellow at the Center for Global Cooperation Research, which is affiliated with the University of Duisburg-Essen. And one of the ways, since I've had some interesting experiences since I've been there, just in the past month and a half, CBS has taken to referring to Duisburg as the Mississippi Delta of Germany. And actually, but honestly, it's a joke, but it is, there are some similarities in that it is sort of this relatively poor post-industrial area that even in sort of neighboring towns, people think about as a place not to go, right? Which is interesting because when I thought about myself and the places I wanted to go in the world, Germany was never one of them. Even when I thought about Europe, like I had actually, in all of my travels, I have never been to Europe until this year. And I had actually made an intentional political decision that I did not want to be engaged with the sort of fetishizing of Europe. And so I made a decision to travel mostly throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa before I took this trip to Europe. So this year I have a fellowship where I'm working on my first book project. I know CBS in the past has talked a lot about her own process, and she's been really instrumental for me in thinking about what that means. We are writing together once a week for like a 2.5 hour block virtually. But one of the things that we talked about and I wanted to share was my first day in Germany. So my first day in Germany, any of you who follow me on social media, you will have already seen this, but my first day in Germany, I was harassed, detained, accosted by, so in Germany, it wasn't actually the police, they call them controllers on the metro system.
Top flight security of the world, Craig.
Yeah. So essentially what happened, Germany has a really, really, really confusing public transportation system. They have like 37,000 different tickets, like even no, I'm serious. They're based on like zones on the train. Even other Germans were just telling me it's confusing even for them. And they also do not have a metro system that has physical barriers. So you can like get on the train without actually like stamping or whatever your ticket. So I knew that I needed a ticket, so I bought a ticket for 10 euros, mind you, knowing that would be above and beyond what I needed to go less than 2 miles. Like I had literally walked to my office the day before. And when I get on the train, I didn't know, like I bought the ticket, but I didn't know what I was supposed to do with the ticket. So I'm sitting down on the train, like the first underground stop, because it started off above ground and went underground. First underground stop, controllers get on the train, ask me for my ticket. So I'm like, cool. This is what happens. They ask you for your ticket. All of a sudden, it's an issue because I didn't stamp the ticket. It goes from me not having stamped the ticket to you need to get off the train to you need to show me your ID. When I showed them my ID, I showed them my US passport. Mind you, I had only been there for 24 hours at this point. Because I wasn't registered with the city, there was then an issue about I don't know whether I was there legally or not, even though I was there legally, because as a US citizen, you have 90 days. But what was interesting about this process is that it was very clear that as a Black person, as a Black woman on the train, that I was being read as one, poor, two, from somewhere that was undesirable, because even as I gave my passport, the question that I was asked repeatedly in this process was where was I born, which is obviously irrelevant in the moment where you have my passport, because all you need is identification. And it's interesting because I was even on a panel about racism for the fellowship, I think 2 or 3 weeks after that. And that there is this sort of way that Germans like to sort of distance themselves from this particular performance of racism in public, which is for me, like, I don't know, this is my everyday life, like this shit happens all the time. But the university was just mortified that this had happened. They continued to sort of take this up. But what was interesting to me is, again, this sort of constant reading of Black people in a certain way, of as being other, as being outside, as not belonging. Also, as the accusation was that I was trying to commit fraud against the public transportation system by not having stamped my ticket. So yeah, it was just an interesting confluence of circumstances that was my entry into Germany. Things have calmed down, I guess, a bit, but we're a Black person traveling in the world. Like I expect this pretty much everywhere I go. So
that's why I'll take public transportation. So I believe in it as an objective human right, but it's just not.
And what about you, madame? You're also on fellowship.
I am. So I'm on my second year of fellowship at the University of Chicago. And so the first year, because of the and things being completely remote, there wasn't too much interaction, too much going on. Everything is now back on campus. There's a vaccine mandate at University of Chicago. And so there's still, I think, limited in terms of bringing speakers and et cetera, but there's much more programming that we plan to do through the Race and Capitalism Project, including workshops, some symposia that will probably be either hybrid or mostly virtual. Looking at racial capitalism, neocolonialism and caste. One, which would be a racial capitalism and kind of keywords event. We're gonna do a new season of New Dawn, have some cool people on the podcast. And of course, I'm going to finish up my manuscript, start with the second manuscript, and then have my book workshop, hopefully in January. So same shit, living in the same apartment, Hyde Park. Yeah, same shit, different years. So I'm really trying to get as much writing as I can done this second year before I go back to full-time teaching. So
but you all will be on this book journey with us. So stay tuned
as
for
usual,
that.
period. So that's what we on.
Okay, now it is time for our new segment, which I'm very excited about because I don't know. I don't know if you all know Risse like I know Risse, but
That's me, CBS.
She got a lot to say about a lot of shit. And as we have been together over this past week, she just had a few like things here and there. And I was like, you know what would be an interesting segment? Risse's Rants. Which she also theoretically called CBS, like
see the
BS.
bullshit. Yes.
And so our thought was, in order to end the podcast on a kind of a lighter note, but still sort of within the realm of what we do, we will have Risse do a rant at the end of every session, at the end of every episode. And so now it's time. What's your rant today?
Yeah, it's slow and to the point. I was reading the New York Times, the short little digest you get in your inbox each morning. And there was some headline that said officials were shocked by the brazenness of the kidnapping of the missionaries in Haiti. So the brazenness. And so it's just interesting to me, right? We're shocked by the brazenness with which the West undermines the sovereignty and steals the resources of the Haitian people and of the Haitian state. So it's just so interesting how the US has this lack of self-awareness about brazenness and what's happening. And the interesting thing is, I just wanted to point out, and perhaps this is the crux of the rant, that the US has brazen kidnapping. It's called extraordinary rendition. So thoughts and prayers for those missionaries.
And those are Risse's Rants.
And that's our show for this Friday evening, y'all. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us. So thanks for tuning in.
I'm Dr. Brown here with Dr. CBS, and thanks to Two Black in the Back, and we're signing off.
Peace.